I used to think that the pinnacle of my life was the view from the top floor of our London headquarters, where the glass walls overlooked a city that seemed to bow to my success. As the creative director of Aura Luxe, I had spent 10 years weaving elegance into the world, believing my own life was the finest tapestry of them all. I was the architect of my marriage, the keeper of a decade of shared secrets, and the woman who believed she had it all. But on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of rain and expensive mahogany, that tapestry did not just fray. It was set ablaze by a single vibration on a conference table. I was mid-sentence, outlining the global expansion of our heritage collection to 20 of the most powerful executives in the industry. My phone, lying face up on the polished wood, lit up with a message from Maya, my oldest friend. It read, "Isabella, are you sitting down? Tell me you are not with Julian." Something shifted in the air, a premonition of ice in a room that was perfectly climate-controlled. I ignored it, but the phone buzzed again. Then a third time. I gestured for my lead designer to take over the presentation and stepped into the hallway, my heels clicking like a countdown against the marble floor. Maya did not even say hello when I answered. Her voice was a ragged whisper, the kind used for funerals and disasters. She asked me where Julian was. I told her he was at a tech conference in Manchester, that he had landed 3 hours ago and sent me a photo of his hotel room. There was a suffocating silence on the other end. Maya told me her cousin, who worked the ground crew at Heathrow, had just sent her a blurred photo from Terminal 5. My husband was not in Manchester. He was at the gate for a flight to Monaco, and he was not alone. The world did not stop spinning. It accelerated until the edges of my vision blurred into a sickening haze. I did not go back into the boardroom. I grabbed my coat, bypassed the elevators, and ran. The drive to Heathrow was a frantic blur of gray rain and red brake lights. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned a ghostly white, and all I could think about were the 3,650 days I had spent building a home for a man who was currently fleeing the country. I thought about our 10-year anniversary last month, the way he held my hand and promised me another 50 years of devotion. It was all a hollow echo now. I reached Terminal 5 and pulled a silk scarf over my head, hiding behind oversized sunglasses and a mask. I felt like a ghost haunting the corridors of my own tragedy. I found them near the business class lounge. My breath hitched, a sharp, physical pain stabbing at my lungs. It was not just Julian. It was his father, his mother, his sister, and her husband. 6 members of the Vane family, the people I had called my own for a decade, were gathered in a circle of radiant, sickening joy. And in the center of that circle stood Serafina. She was young, barely in her early 20s, wearing a loose silk dress that could not hide the prominent curve of her stomach. She was at least 7 months pregnant. The sight was a physical blow that sent me reeling against a cold metal pillar. I watched through the glass, invisible and shattered. My mother-in-law, the woman who had cried at my wedding and held me when my father passed away, was caressing Serafina's belly with a look of infinite tenderness. She was whispering to the unborn child, her face lit with a grandmotherly pride she had never shown me. My father-in-law was laughing, clapping Julian on the back as if he were a conquering hero. And Julian, my Julian, he leaned down and kissed Serafina's forehead, his hand resting protectively on her waist with a familiarity that spoke of years, not months. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was not a drunken mistake. This was a calculated multi-year operation of betrayal. They were not going for a weekend getaway. The suitcases were too many. The goodbyes to the airport staff too final. They were relocating. They were taking my husband, my family, and the money stolen from my father's foundation to start a new life in Monaco, centered around the child I could never give him. Every memory of my marriage began to rewrite itself in my mind. The late nights at the office that were actually spent in her arms, the business trips that were secret vacations, the sudden interest in our foundation's offshore accounts. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with the cold precision of a guillotine. My relationship was not a partnership. It was a long-running scam where I was the only person who did not know the script. I was the bank, the social ladder, and the fool. I stood there for an eternity, watching the people I loved celebrate the life they had stolen from me. I did not scream. I did not storm into the lounge to make a scene that would be captured on social media. My heart, once warm and full of hope, simply calcified into a block of black ice. I took out my phone and recorded them. I captured every smile, every touch, and every betrayal in high definition. They looked so happy, so untroubled by the woman they had left behind in the rain. As they walked toward the jet bridge, Julian looked back once, but his eyes passed over me as if I were nothing more than a stranger in the crowd. And in a way, he was right. The Isabella who had loved him, who had trusted him with her soul, had died in that terminal. As the gate closed, I felt a strange, terrifying calm wash over me. I walked out of Heathrow and into the cold London night, the rain washing the last of my tears away. They thought they were flying toward a new beginning, but they had no idea that I was already drafting their ending. My marriage was over, but my war had just begun. The silence of my apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. For 3 days after the airport, I moved like a ghost, my mind a fractured mirror reflecting only Julian's laughter in Terminal 5. I tried to bury myself in the year-end reports for Aura Lux, but my body finally revolted against the weight of the betrayal. The pain did not come as a wave. It was a jagged blade, twisting deep beneath my ribs until the world tilted and the floor rushed up to meet me. I woke up to the rhythmic hum of a hospital monitor and the scent of sterile air. My best friend Maya was there, her eyes swollen, but it was the expression on the face of the oncologist that stopped my heart. He told me they had found a tumor in my stomach. It was early stage, but the irony was a poison all its own. This was the same silent monster that had claimed my father 5 years ago. As the doctor spoke about survival rates and immediate surgery, the double blow felt like a physical crushing of my chest. While I was fighting for the legacy my father built, the same genetic curse was trying to finish what it started. I was a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, watching my health and my marriage burn simultaneously. My husband was in Monaco celebrating a new life, while I was in a hospital bed contemplating the end of mine. 2 hours later, Arthur Sterling entered the room. He did not bring flowers. He brought a leather briefcase filled with the cold, hard evidence of Julian's infidelity and greed. Arthur sat by my bed and laid out the bank statements like a deck of tarot cards predicting my ruin. Julian had not just been having an affair. He had been a parasite. Over the last 3 years, he had systematically bled the Heritage Foundation dry. This was my father's pride, a fund meant to build schools and clinics, but Julian had treated it like his personal offshore account. He had embezzled $4.8 million. Every cent of that money meant for the vulnerable had been diverted to pay for Serafina's luxury villa, her white sports car, and her private medical care in Monaco. The broken trust felt like shards of glass in my veins. My husband had sat across from me at dinner every night, whispering about our future, while he was literally stealing the bread from children's mouths to fund his mistress. But the depth of his husband's infidelity went even deeper than theft. Arthur handed me a final document, a transaction confirmation for the upcoming year-end audit. Julian's assistant had dropped it off, claiming it was an urgent, routine signature. I scanned the pages with eyes that had seen too much. There, hidden in the dense legalese of Appendix B, Clause 7, was the ultimate trap. It was a share transfer agreement. If I signed that paper, I would unconditionally transfer 20% of my shares in Aura Lux to Julian. With the small portion he already owned, this would give him the majority power to oust me from the board. He wanted it all. He wanted to wait until I was at my weakest, perhaps even dead from the illness he knew nothing about, to swallow my father's life work whole. A cold sweat broke across my skin, but something else woke up inside me. The fire of despair died, replaced by a freezing, calculated rage. Julian thought I was a wounded bird he could easily crush. He thought his affair had left me powerless. He was wrong. Broken trust had not destroyed me. It had transformed me into something far more dangerous. I looked at Arthur, my voice a steady whisper despite the ache in my gut. I told him we would not fight this in the shadows. If Julian wanted to play a game of life and death, I would give him exactly what he wanted. I would sign nothing yet. I would let him believe his plan was working. I would use the next 2 weeks to weave a net so tight he would never see the sky again. The price of his betrayal was going to be everything he ever coveted. I stood before the mirror and stared at a stranger. The illness was already hollowing out my cheeks, but I used it. I stopped wearing makeup, allowed the dark circles under my eyes to deepen, and draped my thinning frame in oversized, somber clothes. I looked like a woman drowning in the wake of a cheating husband and a crumbling empire. This was my camouflage. While Julian was basking in the sun of Monaco with his pregnant mistress, I began to weave a web of shadows across London. I leaked carefully crafted whispers to the city's most notorious gossips, suggesting that Aura Lux was hemorrhaging cash after a fictitious European contract collapsed. I watched the rumors catch fire, turning my father's legacy into a perceived sinking ship. To seal the lie, I did the unthinkable. I listed our ancestral London estate for an urgent sale at 30% below market value. The news hit the headlines like a thunderclap. To the world, Isabella Vane was selling her soul to pay off debts. To the Vanes, it was a siren of alarm. The family that had fed on my resources like vultures suddenly realized their golden goose was about to be slaughtered. Julian's mother called me in a state of pure, unadulterated panic. Her voice was sharp, stripped of the fake warmth she had used for a decade. I played my part perfectly, sobbing into the receiver, telling her I was weak, incompetent, and lost without my husband. I told her the bank was coming for everything. Her greed was the hook. She could not bear the thought of Serafina's child being born into anything less than royalty. She forced Julian to fly back to London immediately, not out of love for me, but to protect the assets he believed he was entitled to. When Julian walked through the doors of our townhouse 48 hours later, his arrogance was a physical weight in the room. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and revulsion, convinced I was a broken woman defeated by his affair. He didn't see a predator. He saw a corpse. He spent the evening lecturing me on my failures, his voice booming with the misplaced confidence of a man who thought he had already won. I waited until the clock struck 11 in the evening. I brought him a thick leather folder, my hands trembling with fake exhaustion. I told him that an anonymous investment fund was willing to inject $10 million into Aura Lux, but they required his signature as a personal guarantee. I called it a debt restructuring agreement. In reality, Arthur Sterling had spent 72 hours crafting a masterpiece of legal deception. The first 10 pages were filled with plausible financial jargon, but the annexes hidden at the back were Julian's tombstone. Julian didn't even read them. He was so blinded by the prospect of saving the company he intended to steal that he barely glanced at the clauses. He wanted the power. He wanted the money. He wanted to finalize our divorce on his terms once the cash was secured. He took my father's fountain pen and signed his name in bold, aggressive strokes on every single page. He didn't realize that with every flick of his wrist, he was signing a comprehensive confession of his embezzlement from the Heritage Foundation. He was signing a total waiver of his marital rights and a voluntary surrender of every asset he had ever touched. He was handing me the keys to his prison cell and smiling while he did it. When he finished, he tossed the pen onto the table and told me to go to bed, calling me useless. I took the folder and walked away, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt a surge of adrenaline that no medicine could provide. The betrayal was now a weapon in my hand. The cheating husband who had tried to bury me was now the one walking into the grave. I sat in the darkness of my father's study, clutching the documents that would incinerate Julian's world. The silent war was over, and the massacre was about to begin. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a queen reclaiming her throne. Julian thought he was the architect of my ruin, but he had just signed his own death warrant. The countdown to his absolute destruction had officially started. The cold, clinical lights of the operating theater were the last thing I saw before the darkness took me. I breathed in the heavy, sweet scent of anesthesia, a one-word text message still echoing in my mind. Begin. While the surgeons prepared to excise the physical poison from my body, the gears of a much larger machine were grinding Julian's world into dust. At 10 o'clock in the morning, while I was drifting into a forced sleep, Julian sat in my father's mahogany chair at Aura Lux, feet propped up on a desk he believed he now owned. The door burst open with a violence that shattered his smug composure. 6 officers from the Metropolitan Police marched in their faces as hard as the handcuffs they carried. Julian was charged with grand larceny, corporate fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. He tried to scream to protest to invoke a power he no longer possessed, but the documents he had signed 48 hours earlier were ironclad confessions. That signature, born of his limitless greed, was the final nail in his coffin. Simultaneously, Maya and David Pascal pulled the pin on a digital grenade. The evidence of Julian's husband infidelity and the Vane family's calculated betrayal was leaked to every major news outlet across the globe. The perfect family image, a facade Julian had meticulously maintained for a decade, was incinerated in a single hour. The headlines were merciless. Corporate heir betrays sick wife. Millions embezzled for secret mistress. Photos of the Heathrow revelation and the frozen bank statements from the Heritage Foundation became the top trending stories on every social media platform. The world watched in real time as the Vane dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. The broken trust I had carried like a lead weight in my chest was finally shared by the public, and their outrage was a wildfire Julian could not extinguish. In Monaco, the karma was swift and brutal. As Julian was being booked into a cold cell in London, the bank accounts funding the luxury life of his mistress were frozen. The locks on the white villa were changed by 2:00 in the afternoon. Serafina, carrying a child, whose future was now as uncertain as a shadow, stood on the sidewalk with my mother-in-law. They were surrounded by designer suitcases they could no longer afford to fill. The woman who had once tenderly caressed Serafina's belly was now screaming at her, blaming the girl's pregnancy for the downfall of her family. They ended up in a dingy motel on the outskirts of the city, a place where the walls were thin and the air smelled of stale smoke and regret. The 2 women who had conspired to replace me were now trapped in a cycle of poverty and mutual loathing, their greed having turned into a noose around their necks. When I finally opened my eyes in the recovery room, the world felt lighter. The sharp, twisting pain in my stomach had been replaced by a dull, manageable ache. The surgeons had removed the tumor, but the legal system had removed the parasite that had been draining my soul. I looked at the rain lashing against the hospital window and felt a profound, quiet peace. My divorce was no longer a looming battle. It was a settled fact. The man who had tried to steal my father's legacy was in a cage, and the family that had mocked my pain was now tasting the bitterness of their own medicine. I was Isabella Vane, and I had survived the worst they could throw at me. The cancer was gone, the betrayal was answered, and for the first time in 10 years, I was truly free. My life was my own again, and the future was a clean, unwritten page. The golden sun of Tuscany heals in ways the cold London rain never could. It has been 1 year since I stood in a courtroom and watched my life be restored while my enemies were led away in chains. Today, I am no longer the woman hollowing out in a hospital bed. I am a woman who has reclaimed her skin, her breath, and her name. From this stone villa nestled among the olive groves and lavender fields, I run the Phoenix Foundation. We are a sanctuary for women who have walked through the fire of betrayal and lost their sense of self. We provide the legal armor and the emotional sanctuary that I once had to build for myself with trembling hands. My body is healthy and my mind is clear, but the echoes of my marriage still linger like a distant storm on the horizon. Last week, I walked into a small bakery in a nearby village and saw a face that belonged to a version of me I thought I had lost forever. It was Leo. He was my college flame, a man who built cathedrals out of light and dreams. We had drifted apart as the world pulled us toward different destinies, but seeing him again was like finding a piece of my soul that had been hidden in a drawer for 10 years. We spent the afternoon in a sun-drenched piazza drinking wine and speaking of the future. He looked at me not with the pity the world offers a victim, but with the reverence one gives a survivor. For the first time in a decade, I felt a spark of something that was not calculated rage or cold strategy. It was hope. It was a relationship built on the foundation of who I had become rather than what I had lost. But peace is often a fragile thing. This evening, as the purple shadows of twilight stretched across the valley, I finally opened an old leather-bound journal that had belonged to my father. It was the one he kept during his final months, the period when Julian was playing the role of the devoted son-in-law. As I turned to the final pages, a small, yellowed slip of paper fluttered out and landed on the terracotta floor. I picked it up, my breath hitching in my throat. It was a note written in my father's shaky, elegant script. The words were a dagger to my heart. It read, "The medicinal broths Julian prepares for me every night are making the fire in my stomach unbearable. The pain is sharp like glass, and my mind feels clouded. I asked him to stop, but he insists it is the only way to heal. I must speak to Dr. Monroe in secret tomorrow. Is my son-in-law the man I think he is, or am I inviting a wolf to my bedside?" My hands began to shake so violently, the paper nearly tore. The realization crashed over me like a freezing wave. Julian had not just been waiting for my father to die. He had been the one holding the scythe. He had used the cover of a terminal illness to accelerate the end, ensuring he could seize control before my father could warn me. The ghost of the past has returned, and it is screaming for justice. My cheating husband is sitting in a prison cell for the money he stole, but the true depth of his evil is far more profound. He did not just break my trust, he may have stolen the life of the man I loved most. As I look out over the darkened hills of Tuscany, I realize that the war is not over. The closure I thought I had found was only a temporary truce. Julian Vane is a thief, a liar, and a betrayer. But as I clutch my father's final words, I know the truth. He is a murderer. And I will not rest until every secret he buried is brought into the light of day. This is no longer a story of survival. It is a story of a daughter who will have her final vengeance. My husband has taken enough, but he will not take the truth to his grave.